So we are very, second, I got to do this. Got it. Okay. We are delighted to have Peter Hodum here this evening, who is a professor of in the biology department and environmental policy and decision-making program at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma. And he's also the Chile program director for Oikonos. You'll have to correct me, Peter. Ecosystem Knowledge, which is a conservation organization in Chile.
Sarah. Uh-oh. Sarah, we can't hear you.
More effectively and authentically involved in conservation. And I'm really eager to hear about that aspect of what you do, Peter.
Sarah,
yes,
you were frozen on the screen for a while.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Would you mind telling us again?
Do I start at the beginning?
Pretty close.
Okay. I just want to make sure that I was frozen for everybody, not just you.
Well, she was frozen for other people, wasn't she? Yeah.
Okay. All right. I will start again. Sorry about that. So Peter is a professor at the University of Puget Sound in the biology department and environmental policy and decision-making. Also the program director in Chile for the Oikonos Ecosystem Knowledge, which is a conservation organization. And in addition to research focusing on the conservation of seabirds and island ecosystems, his work has a strong focus on community-based conservation and how communities can be more effectively and authentically involved. And I was just saying that I'm eager to hear about that aspect of what you do, Peter. So without further ado, I will mute everybody, and then Peter, make sure to unmute yourself and speak.
Great, I am unmuted and I will share my screen and just confirm that.
Peter, I see when I mute all, it mutes you.
Oh, whoops,
there you go.
Okay. There we go. Can everybody see my screen okay? Great. Well, thank you all for the invitation, the opportunity to speak with you tonight. It's been a number of years since I last had a chance to visit Whidbey Audubon. I think it was about 8 years or so ago. So I'm delighted to be back. It would have been nice to have seen you all in person, but this is a smart decision to be virtual still, and it allows more people to participate as well, which I appreciate. So tonight, I'm going to speak about kind of seabirds of our region, which I think it's easy to assume, given how many birders we have here and how many research agencies we have here and universities we have, that seabirds are well studied and well understood. And that's actually not the case, which is exciting in some respects, because there are all sorts of opportunities to advance basic knowledge of status and trends of the seabirds that use our region, both the Salish Sea and the outer coast. But it's also a challenge from a conservation perspective, because if we think about how we advance conservation, it's from an informed perspective. And if we don't know a lot of the fundamentals, including how species are doing, it really complicates efforts to affect meaningful conservation change. So just to get you in the mood a little bit, a few of the focal species that will appear kind of throughout my talk tonight. Tufted Puffin in the upper left, and these three species are all species that we're working on currently. And this, I want to make explicitly clear right now that this is collaborative work. I work with Scott Pearson, who's a senior research scientist at the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, Tom Good at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center of NOAA in Seattle, as well as other colleagues and collaborators. Sue Thomas with the refuge system for Protection Island and a bunch of the outer coast islands. So this is really a team effort. It includes undergraduate students. I apologize. I have a very excited 10-year-old daughter who has a friend over right now. So if you hear some chaos in the background, it's good energy in the house, but I apologize for the distraction. So in terms of just the flow of the talk and where I want to go with you tonight, I wanted to just give a quick, mainly a visual overview of the islands of the outer coast and Salish Sea. Most of you have seen many, if not all, of the San Juan Islands and the islands down a bit farther south from there. Fewer of you have probably seen the outer coast of Washington. It's spectacular, but it's a lot harder to access. And so I wanted to just give kind of a quick visual tour and then talk a bit about the status of seabirds in both regions, the outer coast and Salish Sea. And I distinguish between them because they're two very different systems oceanographically, and they have overlapping but distinct seabird communities. So there are some species that you find in both of those marine environments, and some you only find on the outer coast, and some you only find in the Salish Sea. And then walk through a little bit, just a quick overview of some of the research that is conservation-driven research that my colleagues and I are doing on a suite of these species. And then that will lead us into what do we understand about the threats? And then where to from here? You know, where are the opportunities? Where are the challenges? So at any point, if you have a very pressing question, please interrupt, interject. I know it's a little harder on Zoom. It's not quite as natural, but I want this to be very informal, and I want you to feel free to ask a question if you're concerned about remembering it later on. So I'm going to start on the outer coast, and no visit to the outer coast would be complete without going through Forks and crossing the treaty line from twilight. Some of you may have had grandkids or kids who went through that twilight phase. It's dying down, but there's still signs like this. This is on the way out to La Push from Forks. So the vampires and the werewolves are on the Quileute land, and the vampires are up around Forks. So we're entering vampire country, and I want you to know how seriously we take this. When we are risking life and limb every time we go out onto these islands. Okay. So just a few images of outer coast islands. I'm not going to talk about these in detail, but just to give you a sense of, and these are all small. Many of them would be called islets or rock stacks, but they are spectacular. They have been sculpted and shaped by the Pacific Ocean for millennia, and they are quite dramatic. And as you're looking at these, also, give some thought to access. So these islands are all actually part of the National Wildlife Refuge system, the Washington Maritime National Wildlife Refuge Complex. So they are federally protected. They're closed access. We work closely with the refuge. But as you're looking at them, you give some thought to how do you even get on these islands? There are seabirds nesting on them, but logistically speaking, some of these are really quite inaccessible unless you were to come in by air, and that obviously creates a tremendous disturbance to birds during the breeding season if a helicopter were to hover, or worse yet, land on these islands. Here's one that may look a little bit more familiar to you. This is Protection Island, and we've been working on Protection Island for about 15 years now. This is looking from the north. This is the north face of Protection Island with the Olympics in the background. Nice early morning shot looking across towards Port Townsend. So Port Townsend is just around this point here. In fact, let's see, is that the, these are pointing, okay, great. Yeah, so there's Port Townsend there. Smith Island, which is right in your backyard, just west of Whidbey. This is an island where we have worked for a number of years. It's also part of the National Wildlife Refuge complex, as many of you may know. Most of our work these days is boat-based here. This is the west side of the island. So all of you are back here somewhere tonight. And this is the island that is really, for right now at least, our last reasonable hope for tufted puffins in the Salish Sea. I'll come back to that a little bit later, but Smith is what I would consider relatively speaking, it's the final stronghold for tufted puffins within the Salish Sea. So before I get into the particular species, I wanted to just go through a little bit of the natural history of seabirds. And I do this because I've recognized over the years that not everyone is as obsessed with seabirds as I am. My wife calls it an unhealthy obsession. And so I give a lot of thought to these species. And over the years, I've realized that people aren't, especially for species that are largely out of sight, that you have to be out on the outer coast or even farther offshore to see. They're easy to kind of almost forget about or to not really think about in a life history context. So when we talk about seabirds, they're quite a diverse group. There are several orders of seabirds, and those orders are quite diverse. There's over 340 species of birds that we consider seabirds globally. So fair number, and they range from species that spend their whole lives inshore. You can think about species like the pigeon guillemot, which will go a bit farther offshore, but generally speaking, they're right in sight of land. They come to shore regularly. A lot of gull species are inshore species, to species that are highly pelagic. And pelagic means open ocean, like deep waters, typically well out of sight of land. In that extreme of this range, we have things like petrels and shearwaters and albatrosses. They're some of the most highly pelagic species of seabirds. So a lot of diversity in marine habitats that they use. They are also very long-lived, which means that they have high adult survival. For many species of seabirds, the average life expectancy, assuming the bird reaches adulthood, is 15, 20, 25 years. There are many species that go up to 40, 50 years, and albatrosses have been recorded breeding into their 70s. So they are very long-lived. Kind of tied into that is what we call deferred sexual maturity. So we think about this in contrast or compare and contrast with songbirds, which tend not to live very long. Even if they reach adulthood, they may only live 2 or 3 years, and they start breeding at the age of 1, in part because they don't live very long. So they have to pack a lot into a short life. Seabirds kind of have a different strategy. It's kind of that slow and steady. So it takes them several to many years to begin to breed. But then when they reach that breeding age, they can kind of count on, at least evolutionarily speaking, that they're going to have a number of breeding opportunities over a long period of time, over many years. So a very different strategy to many songbirds that we think of, like sparrows and warblers and so forth. Kind of tied into that is that they also have very low reproductive rates. There are some species of cormorants that may lay up to 4 or 5 eggs, but the vast majority of seabirds across many different orders of seabirds will lay 1 or 2 eggs, at most 3 eggs. If we package that all together, it means that seabirds are really dependent on high adult survival, because that allows the population to defer breeding and reproduce slowly. So they produce fewer but higher quality offspring that hopefully eventually recruit into the population. Most species are also migratory. And that migration may be relatively short. It might be moving from the Salish Sea to the outer coast. But for some species, it's absolutely remarkable, the distances that they cover between breeding seasons. So things like Arctic terns that breed up in the Arctic regions of the Atlantic will migrate all the way down to Antarctica and back between breeding seasons. Sooty shearwaters that breed in New Zealand will do a figure 8 and cover almost the entire Pacific basin, with hundreds of thousands of them wintering up in Alaska, British Columbia, down here into Washington, Oregon, and California before they migrate back. So these are migrations that are sometimes 25 to 30,000 miles in a few months between when they leave the colony and they come back for the next breeding season. So the scale can be vast. And if we think about this from all of these things from a conservation perspective, it means that we're really talking about birds that have very complex lives. They frequently move over large scales. They may use a variety of marine habitats. They take a long time to breed. They really need to, in order for populations to be stable, we need those adults to survive very well. And even under the best of circumstances, they don't produce many offspring in a given year. So all of that tied together have really serious implications for conservation and the particular threats to seabirds and how they interact with these life history characteristics. So with that bit of framing, I wanted to just talk a little bit about what we do know about seabirds in Washington. So we've got the nice map here of the Salish Sea and then the outer coast of Washington. Within the Salish Sea, there's approximately 73 species of marine birds that are either highly dependent seasonally or year-round on the waters of the Salish Sea. On the outer coast, it's at least 50 species, some of which are there year-round, but many of which use those waters seasonally. And a number of those species actually are moving down from the Arctic and conversely migrating up from the Southern Hemisphere. So we have this incredible mix of species, some local, some from the subarctic and Arctic, and then some from the Southern Hemisphere, all kind of converging on our waters, mainly during the summer months when we have so much productivity on the outer coast. So of those species, we have two that are federally and or state listed because of their conservation status, the marbled murrelet and the tufted puffin. And there are several other species that are of conservation concern. So within the Salish Sea, that means that we have 8 species of concern at either the Washington state level and or the federal level. And I'm going to make this point twice. It's going to come up again on the next slide. This is really important to frame some of the work that I'm going to be talking about. That is that for many species, and I alluded to this kind of in my introductory comments, we really don't understand even the basics. We don't really know what their conservation status is. We don't know how their populations are doing. So what I have down at the bottom are 2 tables. This left table is for alcids, so guillemots, auklets, murrelets, and so forth, and then our 3 breeding cormorant species in Washington waters. And on the right side are loons and grebes. So we've got 4 categories for loons and then 3 species of grebes. And what I've done in this table is compiled the results from different surveys. These are birds on the water. The first one is a marbled murrelet boat-based survey. This is done by the state of Washington. Puget Sound Seabird Survey. Some of you may actually be volunteers for the Puget Sound Seabird Survey. It's a community science program led by Seattle Audubon. This third one is the British Columbia Coastal Waterbird Survey. And this last one is a state agency initiative, the Puget Sound Ambient Monitoring Program. You don't need to remember all of those. The take-home message here is if you look at the arrows, so arrows that are horizontal mean that there's no detected trend, that the population for that species over the time series for that survey seems to be stable. An upward pointing arrow means that the population is thought to be increasing based on the survey results, and a downward arrow suggests that indicates that the population is declining based on that survey. So if you kind of look across this, what we would love to see is consistency, right? We would like to know, like for pigeon guillemots, are they really stable? Well, the Barnwell-Burlett survey results suggest they are. We don't really have good results from the Puget Sound Seabirds survey. British Columbia survey suggests that they're actually increasing. Okay, which is it? Rhinoceros auklets. We see the full range of possibilities across 3 different survey methods. So what I want to leave you with right here is this idea that even with surveys that we are doing, it can be difficult to tease out what's really happening with populations in our region. And that's one of the big challenges of this work, is understanding, are declines real? Are changes in the population real, or are they an artifact of different methodologies that people are using? So if we look across here, what I've done is reordered that information a little bit, just to frame it a little differently. So we have 5 families represented, 5 families of seabirds represented commonly or consistently in the waters of the Salish Sea and the outer coast. Storm-petrels are just on the outer coast, except when they get blown in by major storms, during the winter months. There's 2 species that breed, one of which is a species of conservation concern, the Leach's storm-petrel. So this column is vulnerable or endangered status. And then the species, these are just the 4-letter acronyms or abbreviations, the codes for them. Petrels and shearwaters, I'm going to come back to this in a minute. There's possibly 1 species of shearwater. It has not been documented, but we are seeing them out there, Manx shearwaters. And I'll come back to this idea in a minute. But again, we don't even know if they're breeding on the outer coast or not. For the alcids, we have 2 species of conservation concern, the tufted puffins and the marble merlets. We also have rhinoceros auklets, pigeon guillemots, Cassin's auklets, common murres. Again, though, for some of these species, we don't have good population data. And then in the last few years, with some data, again, that I'll come back to shortly, there's been a suggestion that they might actually be breeding on the outer coast of Washington. Not really been described previously. Cormorants, we have 3 species, none of them are of conservation concern. Most gulls, especially, terns not so much, gulls, it's a mess. How many species? Well, it depends on how much they're hybridizing. Are they really glaucous-winged gulls? Are they glaucous-winged western gull hybrids? Are they both? But we do have Caspian terns in the region as well. So again, I want to just re-emphasize this point as kind of a central framing idea for this talk, is that for many of these species, we still really don't have good information on how they're doing. How are they faring? So that's both a challenge and an opportunity. So in terms of the species that we're focusing on, we're working on multiple species. One of the principal ones is the tufted puffin, driven largely by its conservation status. It's state listed in Washington. It is a federal candidate for listing under the Endangered Species Act. It's being considered for listing in Oregon and California. So it's really struggling down here in what we call the California current. There's also evidence of it declining in British Columbia. So kind of throughout its southern part of its range, it's not faring well. There are, in the last few years, we've published, so this is a state publication that I contributed to, There was an initial status report for the tufted puffin. That was in 2015, up here on the left. That's the one where we made the argument that the species should be listed as endangered in the state. That was accepted and approved. It's now state listed. And then a year and a half or so ago, we crafted this tufted puffin recovery plan. And that's now the document that's helping to drive a lot of our efforts and help us prioritize things. We also have been working on Rhinoceros Auklets for about 16 years now. They are not of conservation concern in our region. Wonderful species. It is, one point I want to make here, but before I risk forgetting it, is that although they're called an auklet, they really are a puffin. So functionally and genetically, they really are a puffin, but their common name is an auklet. So think about them as kind of a sister species to tufted puffins. Leach's storm-petrels, they are that's a species of conservation concern in our region, and there are really no good data at all on storm-petrel population trends in our region. Cassin's auklet, another wonderful little alcid. They're considered near threatened, but again, a species of conservation concern for which we do not have a good sense of how their population is faring. So these, again, are species that nest on these difficult to access islands. They're fragile islands. They're islands that are really not conducive to doing significant sustained work. So with the Fish and Wildlife Service, we're trying to use innovative, low impact methods for the benefit of the islands as well as the seabird communities. So one of these kind of cool high tech approaches that we use, and these are used increasingly widely in wildlife research, including for bats and songbirds, are acoustic recording units. So basically, this is a glorified high-tech recorder that you can program. So you can tell it when you want it to be recording, when you don't want it to be recording. It will work for months at a time in the field. And at the end of it, you basically download your data and you generate sonograms. So you can deploy these on islands or wherever, come back a few months later, and they're recording all the ambient noise during their sampling periods, which is a great way to understand what you have on these islands with a minimal impact. So here's an example of what we see for storm petrels. So the y-axis, each of these little bands here is a different ARU or recording unit. So in this panel, we have 5 deployed on Destruction Island. We have 1 on East Bedelta. We have 1 on Middle Bedelta. And then these are the dates. So we've been doing this for a few years now. This is just a snapshot from 2017. And so we have May, June, July, August, September. And for each of these ARUs or recording locations, the y-axis is the number of calls per minute. So you can interrogate these recordings and you can say, using all sorts of clever things that I can't do, but some of my colleagues are experts in, because sound analysis is quite complicated. You can automate it. So your computer is actually going through and saying, yep, there's a storm petrel call, there's a storm petrel call. Nope, that's not, that one is, that one is. And so it really speeds up the process. It's not as though we're listening to thousands of hours manually. It wouldn't be practical. So what we can see is, like, at this location, there really were no calls throughout, and we don't know for sure whether or not storm petrels are breeding on Destruction Island. We hear a few when we're camping out there and working out there at night, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're breeding there. So in this location, you can see there's a few little blips here, but not much going on. Suggests probably not here. These were probably a few individual birds that were circling and saying, is anybody here? You know, and they weren't getting much response, and then they probably left. We had a similar thing down in this other destruction island. But this is the cool part. When we get down to the deltas, and I'll show you a map of where they are, with these little rock stacks between La Push, and so they're north of La Push, between Nia Bay and La Push. What we see is, especially on middle Delta, there's evidence of calls over multiple months, and in some periods, actually a number of calls per minute, suggesting there's a lot of activity. It doesn't demonstrate conclusively that they're breeding on that island, but this information says, you know, maybe East Delta, if we're going to look for burrows, maybe we don't spend a lot of time on East Delta. We want to invest more effort on middle Delta to really try to nail down whether or not they're breeding on this island. So we can use the same approach for Manx shearwaters. So here's a nice raft of shearwaters on the outer coast. Most of these are sooty shearwaters. There might be a short-tailed mixed in there. So these are some of the birds that are coming from New Zealand. But then right here in the foreground, we have two smaller shearwaters. These are Manx shearwaters. Manx shearwaters, quote, are not supposed to, quote unquote, be here. They breed in the North Atlantic. What are they doing here? Is it that they just got geographically embarrassed and they're in the wrong ocean basin? They went up the wrong side of South America and now they're in the Pacific rather than the Atlantic? I mean, that presumably happened, but are these birds actually, we see them regularly enough on the outer coast that it wouldn't be unreasonable to think that there might be a small breeding population on one of these poorly known islands. So that those ARUs can help us. You know, we can put them out, come back a few months later, do the same thing we were doing for the storm-petrels. Are we hearing any Manx shearwater calls over any of the islands? And that's the same approach we are taking with ancient merlets. There's a nice ancient merlet in breeding plumage. And here you can see, so this situates you, this little inset map. There's Cape Flattery and Nia Bay up here. You go down the coast a bit. And just north of Lake Ozette is this area, the middle and east Deltas. Then there's West Delta, but that's a tiny stack. So we deployed ARUs on these to see if not just storm petrels were breeding there, but if there was evidence of ancient merlets. And right here, this is what the data look like. This is called a sonogram, and it's an acoustic. This is a visual representation of the acoustics of a call. I'm not an expert in these, but I wanted to show you what it looks like because essentially what the machine learning in the computer is doing is it's being told, look for this acoustic signature here that's in the box. That's an ancient merlet. So it will zoom through these thousands of hours of recordings, and this is something else. This actually looks like it might be a storm petrel, but this signature here is characteristic of an ancient merlet. And so we're actually, and these are ARUs that only are sampling on the island, which means that there were ancient merlets on East Delta Island itself. So that again may help direct our efforts and say, well, there's dozens of islands out there. Many of them are difficult to get onto. Let's try to focus our efforts and use these tools to be efficient about where we try to determine to put our efforts. So some islands again that we're working on currently. This is an island, Alexander Island, that is just north of Destruction Island. It's a bit north of Ruby Beach, south of La Push. And this is an island we've just started working on a couple of years ago. And then with COVID coming in, it's made it difficult for us to get back out to the last couple of years. But it's an island of interest to us because there are tufted puffins on it. There are rhinoceros auklets. There are Cassin's auklets. There are storm-petrels. Beautiful island. And I just want to, this is a nice photo of some of my colleagues. So This is Scott Pearson from Department of Fish and Wildlife, mentioned earlier, Tom Good from NOAA, Sue Thomas from the Refuge. I bring a lot of students out on this work, and they do their senior thesis research with us. This is one of my star students a couple of years ago, Lily. And then Chad Norris back here is a biologist with the state. He works for Scott and is the boat captain and a really good biologist. So on the island, so this island has no non-native mammals. It looks like the outer coast islands have looked historically. And I wanted to show you this because I'm going to show you some pictures from Destruction Island a little bit later, and there's a big contrast. So really dense burrows in here. All of this tussock, this bunch grass, these perennial grasses that have deep roots. This is 2 to 3.5 feet tall, very dense, and it provides stable habitat for burrowing birds. So these burrows persist really well. There aren't really serious issues with erosion. Again, this is on Alexander. Here's the outer coast of Washington. For scale, I think that might be Lily in this picture, but we're up a few hundred feet above the water. And then down here in the distance, right on the horizon, that is to the south, and that is Destruction Island. So we've been working on Destruction Island for 13 years now. Another amazing island. It's just such a privilege to be able to spend time on these islands. So until recently, this island was managed by Fish and Wildlife as part of the refuge system. It's recently moved ownership or management in the federal government, and it's now being administered and managed by the Coast Guard, who historically managed it because they had an active lighthouse station on it. So it's kind of gone back to them. And we have a good-sized population of Rhinoceros Auklets on the island. There's a happy parent coming back with a couple of herring for a chick. Brandt's cormorants, and there's a nice seabird community on the islands. There's pigeon guillemots. There are, well, it's a small population now, but glaucous or hybrid gulls, glaucous-winged western gulls. And we don't know, again, even though we've been working on the island for a number of years now, we're still unsure if storm-petrels are breeding on the island. Within the Salish Sea, our efforts are focused primarily on Protection Island, shown here. So this is the kind of the southwest facing cliffs, and then the south. And so many of you will be aware that there was a fire on Protection Island in early August this year. This is the area, this spit here, and these slopes and a little bit on the top are what burned. The island is joint ownership. It's managed primarily by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as part of the refuge system, but this area in the south part is actually a state refuge. So it's administered by Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. Again, a really nice suite of seabird species on the island, including hundreds of pairs of pigeon guillemots, which are near dear to all of you in Whidbey Audubon, given that wonderful pigeon guillemot network that you've established and expanded over the years. And then Smith Island, which is right off your back porch practically. Again, this is an island where we're primarily working from the boat, although we have done some island-based kind of population estimates and a bit of population monitoring, mainly of Rhinoceros Auklets. But at present, we're focused primarily on the island as this refuge for tufted puffins. Nice Brandt's cormorant there in flight, just offshore of the island. So what I'm going to do now is transition to talking a little bit about, or provide a bit of an overview on some of the species and the work that we're focusing on, and beginning with tufted puffins. So this is out on Destruction Island. And I'm not going to talk in great detail about results, but just to give you a sense of what we're doing, and I can talk a bit more detail if there are questions later. But to put this into context, I wanted to show you a little bit about the magnitude of the decline in tufted puffins. And I'll say here too that what we see in Washington about the magnitude is what has been documented in Oregon and California as well. So we have historic records from the early 1900s and records sporadically since then of the number of active colonies. So these are the number of different islands on which breeding by tufted puffins was confirmed. In the early 1900s, so late 1800s, early 1900s, the best estimate was 43 colonies, 43 different islands. In the late 70s, early 80s, we'd lost some, but we still retained the majority of them. 35 of 43 were still active. Most recently, and these are the most recent surveys that Scott and I have done. They're now about 7 years old. We're down to 19. So we're less than half of the historic colonies or islands are even active. So that's massive, even without trying to account for the number of birds that suggests. And this figure over here on the right, there's 3 panels. Here's the outer coast of Washington. And this is our best estimate of what islands were used by puffins in the late 1800s to mid 1900s. Here's the late 70s to 80s. And this is what we have today. One of the things to note, if you can see it well enough, is not just the change in the number of dots, but the change in which dots we see. So the colors correspond to the size of the estimated size of the colonies. So 100 years ago, we had at least 2 colonies that were estimated to be greater than 10,000 birds. Today, the largest colonies we have are in the hundreds. We don't even have colonies in the thousands, let alone 10,000. In the Salish Sea, the story is even grimmer. Now, recognize that, so here we have the San Juan Islands, Protection Island is down here, there's Dungeness Spit, just to orient you. So again, the same time periods, late 1800s, early 1900s. Recognize these were pretty small colonies. None of these colonies, aside from Smith and Protection, were thought to have been more than 100, possibly up here in the northern San Juans. Mid 1970s, they're already starting to drop out. And today, the only 2 colonies we have in the entire Salish Sea are Smith and Protection Island. So colony sizes prior to 1978, our best estimate, and a lot of these data are very approximate, but we think that there were at least 9 colonies in the state that had at least 1,000 individuals, and 2 with at least 10,000 individuals. Contrast that with what we have today. We don't have a single colony in the state that has even 1,000 birds. And at best, we have 3 colonies statewide with 100 to 200 birds. So these are hugely significant declines within the last century. And really, it looks like the tipping point was the late 70s, early 80s, where these populations started to really crater. So the estimated annual rate of decline is about 9%, which is really worrying. These are, again, very crude, but anything for us, especially a seabird that is long-lived, slow to reproduce, a species like the tufted puffin only produces 1 egg a year. It can't replace a lost egg or a lost chick. It has 1 kick at the can each year. So even under the best of circumstances, pairs can produce 1 fledgling a year, and only a fraction of those will survive. To give you a sense of kind of the magnitude of these estimates, and again, these are very crude, but our best approximation was about 25,000 birds on the outer coast in the early 1900s, so about 100 years ago. 40 years ago, that was still thought to be about 23,000. And currently, we think it's less than 3,000. So this is nearly an order of magnitude drop. much of it in the last 4 decades. And as I mentioned before, we're seeing similar levels of decline throughout what we call the California current system, which is the California current is this large coastal current system that extends from California up into southern British Columbia. So here's a shot of the colony on Destruction Island. Almost all of the remaining breeding birds are on this slope and a few on the back side of it. So in this picture, you can see how different the vegetation looks. This island should look the same as Alexander. It has the same basic plant composition, but this island has had human intervention because of the lighthouse, but this island also had European rabbits introduced to it by lighthouse staff in the 1970s. Those rabbits are still on the island. We're part of a multi-organization proposal to remove the rabbits. We should know in the next few months whether that is going to be funded. If so, it would be a huge conservation gain for the outer coast of Washington. But those rabbits really alter profoundly the plant communities wherever they are, but especially on islands. We do a lot of observational work. This is one of my former students, Robin, down here. This is one of our observation points looking back across this channel to that slope. And so we're able to do observations, direct observations, without having any interaction with the birds whatsoever. We can also sit up on a couple of hills and count birds at sea and look at activity patterns. Notice that I'm also showing you pictures of beautiful conditions. It's not always quite so lovely on the outer coast of Washington, even in the summer. So some of the things we look at are, we're trying to understand not just how many are breeding and how successful that breeding is, but trying to understand things like how frequently do they provide food to their chicks? So burrow visitation rates. Here is an adult breeding puffin coming out of burrow number 32. It had just dropped a fish off for its chick and is about to head back to sea. We can also use colony activity patterns. So how many puffins are on the surface of the colony? How many are sitting on the water? How many are in flight? And we can, if we do that multiple times over a season and then do that over multiple years, we can actually get another indication of population trends. We use things like trail cameras or motion sensitive cameras. So there are 2 here. This camera is on a post. This is a tufted puffin burrow. So any sort of motion will trigger that camera. So we can also use that to capture birds coming and going from burrows. And it looks, and here's a camera right up here in the upper right, and it's almost like this bird is posing for the camera. But just behind this bird, and these stakes here mark tufted puffin burrow entrances. So they are a burrow nesting seabird. These burrows will go back a meter, so 3, 4, 5 feet deep into the soil. We also look at diet. So we're trying to understand what they eat, whether that's changing, how that compares with other areas, how that varies year to year. So we do a lot of photography and then use the photos to identify what's in the bill, how many fish are in the bill, and how large the fish are. So this is Lily doing observations of puffins from that same point. And again, using our cameras to generate images like this, where we can actually tell what species they are, how many fish are in the bill, and use the bill as kind of a ruler to approximate the size of the fish. And that allows us to compare between locations, islands, years. So we can bring that work into conversation with complementary work that we've been doing over the same period of time with Rhinoceros Auklet. So again, these are both puffins, and we can ask questions about how they're doing. So population size, well, the evidence that we have from our work and some work from the 70s that kind of helps us frame our work in a longer term context than the 15 years we've been working. Rhinoceros auklets throughout most of Washington appear to be increasing. Even in the Salish Sea, they seem to be thriving. Tufted puffins, they're declining. What's different? What's going on? They're both burrow nesting seabirds. They both nest on the same islands in most cases. They feed on similar prey, but maybe there's something with prey or prey flexibility. We've seen increased reproductive success for Rhinoceros auklets compared to the 1970s. Tufted puffins, it's declined. Diet has really stayed stable for the Rhinoceros auklets. And we don't have historic data for tufted puffins. So we're really starting from zero with that, unfortunately. We have used a technique called stable isotope analysis, which allows us, it uses the naturally occurring isotopes of carbon and nitrogen. If folks want to nerd out with the science of it later, I'm happy to answer more detailed questions about it. But it allows you to understand kind of the trophic level of species. And this works for us for anything that's a consumer. And so one of the cool things about this technique is you can go into museum specimens and you can sample birds. In this case, we went and used samples from the Burke Museum up in Seattle, up at UW, and the Slater Museum of Natural History that we have at the University of Puget Sound. And we were able to get tufted puffin samples from across 100 years, going back to the 1920s, the late 19-teens. We would sample the feather, we would analyze the carbon and nitrogen, and then we could compare across time to see if the isotopic signature suggested that there was a change in the food web, where they were feeding in the food web, or their trophic level. Interesting, and we did that for both of these species. Interestingly, there was no evidence of what we would call a trophic shift or a trophic decline in tufted puffins. It's actually been documented in marbled merlets. And so we thought, well, this is also a declining species. And we know that there have been changes in availability in forage fish, or a lot of the prey species that they seem to be depending on. Maybe they're actually feeding a little lower trophically. They're feeding on things that aren't as good or as high quality, and that might have implications for their breeding success. But the stable isotope analysis suggests that that's not the case. But the stable isotopes can't tell us anything about the abundance of the food. It's just telling us, is there evidence that their diet has really changed a lot? And there isn't, at least in our region. But it might just be that there's not enough of that food that they really depend on. So we can use the Rhinoceros auklets as, to help us better understand what might be driving these declines in tufted puffins. And that kind of transitions into talking a little bit about threats to seabirds in Washington waters. Many of these threats are not unique to our waters. They are common to seabirds in many parts of the world. So, apropos of those most recent comments about diet, there's abundance and there's availability, and they're not always the same thing. Abundance just means how many are there. Availability is of what's there. How much is accessible? How much is it available to the predator? So we do know that for many forage fish species, and especially here in the Salish Sea, herring numbers have really declined significantly. Herring are an important part of seem to be an important part of the diet of tufted puffins around Smith Island. So changing prey availability is a threat. Recovery of avian predators, and this is an interesting dilemma, because a wonderful conservation success story, and one that I, as a conservation biologist, celebrate, is the recovery of raptors. From all of the issues with pesticides and DDTs and their related compounds. we have seen remarkable recoveries of bald eagles, of peregrine falcons. Those are to be celebrated. But what has happened is, while those birds, as they are recovering, they're recovering into an ecosystem that is very different than it was 70 years ago or 100 years ago. We have reduced forage fish populations. We have much smaller, especially, this isn't relevant for peregrine falcons, but certainly it's true for bald eagles. We have greatly reduced populations of salmon. These are very opportunistic species, and they will shift their diet based on what's available. So if there's less fish, they can shift their focus to seabirds. And so the recovery of bald eagles into our system has had pretty severe consequences for a number of seabird species, because eagles are targeting them. We have counted in surveys around Protection Island up to 56 bald eagles on or flying above the island during the summer months. That's staggering to think about. And this is where some of the differences between Rhinoceros auklets and tufted puffins may come into play. Tufted puffins are active. They come and go from the burrows primarily during the daytime, which is when predators like bald eagles and peregrine falcons are also mainly active. In contrast, Rhinoceros auklets come and go at night. So they're coming in at night, they're leaving at night, and so they're less vulnerable to disturbance by avian and predation by these predators. Contaminants and pollution. It's good to think about this on two levels. There's kind of acute issues, things like oil spills or discharges of contaminants, or a release of sewage. Those are events that happen in a moment in time. But then we also have chronic issues with pollution and contamination. So things like PCBs and these persistent pollutants that can stay in the water, that can stay in the sediment indefinitely. And those are issues that affect seabirds, because seabirds are feeding relatively high up on the food chain. They're feeding on fish that are feeding on other fish that may be feeding on plankton. So you get what's called bioaccumulation. As you eat things that have contaminant loads, you start to concentrate those pollutants and contaminants in your own body. And then if you are then eaten, that organism is concentrating it even further, which is one of the big reasons that one of the big threats to orcas, the southern resident killer whales in our region, is the fact that they have incredibly large loads of contaminants in their body tissues. Fisheries bycatch. I just showed a gill net here. This is being addressed. It's not resolved. There has been some wonderful work to reduce it, but things like being caught on fishing lines, being caught in nets in different fisheries has been an issue, and historically has been a big issue for a number of seabirds. And it's still not fully resolved. Shoreline armoring. So when you harden the shoreline to stabilize the slopes, that's actually cutting off those feeder bluffs and the input of nutrients and everything that's naturally wanting to slough off into that inshore area. It breaks that connection. And that then has implications for the productivity of those inshore waters. And that can then in turn have implications for prey species that would historically have used those waters. Introduced species. So an example, again, here's a European rabbit in a stare down with a tufted puffin out on Destruction Island. But there are also introduced plant species. Thankfully, on most of these key islands in Washington, because they've been set aside and they're closed access, they have, those actions have protected them from a lot of the impacts that we see in many other islands. So we don't have problems with feral cats on these islands. We don't have problems with rats and mice. But there are introduced plant species that change the plant communities, which can change breeding habitat. And then on some islands, there are European rabbits. Disturbance, this is in theory an issue. In practice, in many places, it's not really, because of the inaccessibility of the islands and the fact that many of them are closed access. But at sea, movement of fishing vessels and pleasure craft and so forth through areas that might be important foraging areas can really have a significant impact. Harmful algal blooms, which leads us into climate change. These are interrelated. Climate change that's an existential issue. It's not something that we have the capacity to do anything meaningfully about within our conservation program, except to acknowledge it and talk with people and try to make large-scale societal changes. But that's what it's going to require. And then related to that is ocean acidification, which is changing the chemistry of ocean waters, which has implications for species up and down the food web. So I wanted to just really quickly talk about forage fish as a real key bottleneck in all of what we're talking about here, and the ecological connectedness. So I really like this figure that was generated by the Pew Environment group. So if we think about energy flow moving from lower trophic levels or lower down in the food chain, so plankton, phytoplankton, and zooplankton, then we have moving up, and you can see how there's this narrow waist or this bottleneck right in here. So these forage fish, anchovy, herrings, sand lance, smelt, small salmon, all fit in that ecological niche. So they're feeding on phytoplankton and small zooplankton, maybe other small fish. They are the key to everything above them, including larger predatory fish, marine mammals of different types, including orcas, whales, all the way up through and including seabirds and humans. So recognizing that if we want to leverage things, if we want to make an argument, and we want to take action as the public, really raising these issues, making sure our representatives, our policymakers, understand this idea and this critical juncture here, because if this is not functioning well, it affects everything below it and everything above it. And this figure down here is a simplified food web. On the left is kind of a simplified representation of a food web in our region historically. So maybe say about 100 years ago, maybe even 70 years ago, compared with present day. The bolded categories are important drivers or groups in this food web. So in the historical context, what we see is seabirds were more numerous. They had a really big impact. They fed heavily on forage fish. Forage fish are bolded. They also affected things like benthic invertebrates and so forth. But forage fish here, then you can see salmon, rockfish, seabirds, all really keying in on forage fish. And killer whales, it's not to say killer whales aren't important, but numerically they never had the same level of impact as say salmon or seabirds had historically. We look at the present day, what's bolded? Seabirds are no longer bolded because many species have declined. The Rhinoceros Auklet notwithstanding. Salmon are no longer bolded because we've lost a huge proportion of those populations. Rockfish have also declined, although some are starting to rebound. So none of these are bolded. Forage fish are no longer bolded because, again, many of those populations have declined significantly. So what's actually driving a lot of the system? Well, ratfish, Dungeness crabs, jellies are a lot more common, a lot more abundant now than they were 20 or 30 years ago. So again, recognizing the dynamics and how all of these things connect to one another ecologically, and the implications for when one or more of those ecological groups gets perturbed, becomes disproportionately abundant or declines disproportionately, that will set off kind of a ripple effect throughout the system. So just to wrap up really quickly, towards the future, I don't want to leave on a depressing note. And there are some reasons for optimism. There's growing awareness. The fact that there are, I can't see right now, I think it's probably 70 or 60 or 70 people showing up on a Thursday evening, for a talk. That's amazing. That alone gives me hope. What we do need to do is continue this this applied research and monitoring so that we can better understand the trends. How are these species faring? And that will also help us better understand the relative importance of threats. So we're not doing this research just because, and not just because we love seabirds. It's because we see this sort of information as fundamental to informing conservation planning. So understanding how they're doing in the breeding season. Are the issues during the breeding season? Are they at other stages of their annual cycle? How are they using marine habitat? Are there areas that are really important consistently that we say, maybe we should talk about a marine protected area in this area, in this spot, because a suite of species use it consistently. We are incredibly fortunate in the state of Washington to have this refuge complex that I've mentioned. From a tufted puffin perspective, nearly all former and current tufted puffin colonies are federally protected as part of this refuge complex. That is a godsend. It removes many concerns that we might otherwise have, or potential threats that might otherwise exist if they were not so rigorously protected. We do have opportunities to try to improve habitat. So do habitat restoration on breeding islands. If we are able to do the eradication of rabbits from Destruction Island, we have a plan to do habitat restoration to stabilize slopes, reintroduce native plants to improve breeding habitat for those burrowing seabirds. We're talking about some similar things possibly on Smith and Protection Island with the refuge staff right now. Forage fish populations. Again, without forage fish populations, we have no seabirds. So, even though I'm looking at it through the lens of seabirds, and their conservation and well-being over time, it does come down, it's driven largely, not exclusively, but largely by what's happening with forage fish. And so with that, I'd like to say thank you very much. And I've put my contact information down at the bottom. There are my two email addresses if anybody does want to contact me on outside of the meeting, but I will open it up if anybody has questions or comments, observations.
Peter, this is Sarah. Do you want to stop sharing your screen so we can see people?
Yes, I will do that right now.
Hopefully they've gotten the information from it. Thank you. That was fabulous and really fascinating. And there are a few questions that have come in that I will share from the chat. Susie asked, is the decline, I think this was in the puffins, it came in when you were talking about the puffins, is the decline due to the change in climate, temperature, or habitat?
Oh, Susie, I wish that is an excellent question. I wish I could answer it. And that's kind of where we're at right now with the puffin. We just don't know. It's probably a combination of factors. And the challenge is, so we don't think it's a single, it would be much easier if it were a single smoking gun, if it were just, say, fisheries bycatch. And if we could address that, everything would be resolved for them. But we suspect it's a combination of both some recent historical issues and what's going on currently. So with tufted puffins, there was, until these mitigation measures were put into gillnet fisheries, starting about 15 years ago, tufted puffins were caught consistently in salmon gillnet fisheries throughout the state. And that was kind of an ongoing chronic. We don't really have a good sense of the magnitude of it, but we know they were being caught. So there was, and those are adult birds. So we're losing adults from the population because of that. We also know that, like on the outer coast, there have been several oil spills. There was the Tenumaru in the 90s on the outer coast of Washington. We know that killed a lot of seabirds. It was a pretty big spill that had widespread impacts. So now you've got two things that probably have knocked the population down before people were really paying attention to the population. So we don't really know how much of an impact they had, but they had some level of impact. And now more recently, we know that there is climate change. We know that there is changing food availability. We know that rabbits are disruptive to breeding seabirds, at least on those few islands like Destruction Island where they co-occur. So where we're at right now is trying to better understand which of those threats are the most important to the species, and we don't have an answer to that yet. Climate, unfortunately, with some of those things, we actually can take meaningful actions. As I mentioned earlier, climate change, that's something that if it's driven primarily by climate change, in terms of conservation actions over the short term, there's really not much we can do. So we hope it's not driven all by climate change, and we suspect it's not. But we are perilously close to losing tufted puffins throughout the California current system.
Thank you, Peter. I've got a couple more in the chat, but first I'll call on Frances, who has her hand up.
Hi, Peter. It's really nice to hear your talk tonight and just really appreciate how you've given us a broad sense of what's going on in the seabird world. Here on Whidbey, as you know, we're focused on the guillemots, which we love and continue to monitor. So this is really so important for us to see the broader picture. And I just wanted everybody to know that when Phyllis Kind and I started the Guillemot Project years and years ago, Peter was one of our main mentors. And so I've always just been so appreciative of the time that he spent to get us started on what has become now almost a decade, 2 decades long project. So thank you for tonight, Peter, and thank you for your help along the way in so many ways.
Thank you, Frances. Yeah, it's great to see you. I was just so delighted to see your name in the list earlier. And Frances, in her characteristic way, is overly humble. I feel as though my greatest contribution was to not get in Frances and Phyllis's way. They have a remarkable vision, and that project, I think, is again one of those examples of what gives me hope. Is people who are saying, I want to make a difference, and I have a vision, and I'm going to make it happen. And now you're in your second decade of the program, and it's now it's no longer even the Whidbey Pigeon Guillemot program. It's down in the South Sound, and it's out on the peninsula, and the scope of it is expanded. And the reason it's expanded is because fundamentally, Phyllis and Frances's vision was so timely, and it was so well thought out that folks like me are like, this is awesome. How can we help, and how can we not impede it? And you're doing work that is unique, that we don't have the capacity to do. We could never do the work at the scale that you are doing through that program if it relied on kind of professional research scientists. And it's a great example of why community science is just so, when it's done thoughtfully and with intention and care, how impactful it can be and is.
Thanks, Peter.
Peter, Dave asked, what does the study of tufted puffin carcasses tell us about their contaminant loads and possible impacts to their viability?
Yeah, so we have a vanishingly small sample size of contaminant loads in tufted puffins. We have to date, and we need to do, part of it is just funding, but so Tom Good, my colleague from NOAA, opportunistically a few years ago, as part of a contaminant study with forage fish, he managed to get a tufted puffin that we had found, like a freshly dead tufted puffin, and had its tissues analyzed for a number of contaminants. And this was a bird from Protection Island. And it had I can't remember the exact levels, but it was shockingly high. We were, when we got the results, we were like, oh my gosh, we didn't think it was going to be that high. So they are, I don't want to say too much. Maybe that bird was an unusual bird, but it does suggest that these birds are carrying meaningful contaminant loads. And Dave, I'm happy to elaborate on that if you wanted more information, or if that didn't quite address what you were asking.
Yeah,
Thank you, Peter. Oh, Dave, did you want to say any more?
No, I don't now. That was unfortunate to hear that, though. But
it does mean, that's something that we have as a goal, when we can get the funding to support the analyses, is to do a bit more of that. One of the challenges with that is it's easier for us to do that on Rhinoceros auklets because they occur in the thousands on these breeding islands. And so you do find carcasses partially eaten, that are taken by owls or eagles. And so we can opportunistically grab tissues from them. But when we're talking about a handful of puffin pairs on an island, the odds of you finding a freshly dead carcass are vanishingly small. And that's a real challenge. And these puffins are really sensitive to disturbance. And so very intentionally, we do as much as possible that's completely hands-off. Because these birds will abandon. They'll abandon eggs, they'll abandon small chicks if they're handled too much. And so we don't even ban them, which limits some of the things we can say, but we don't feel like we can justify the risk of that disturbance. We're at the stage where every egg, every chick that's produced needs the best chance possible of surviving.
Peter, you talked when you were sort of in some of the introductory stuff about how many of these seabirds migrate, and some migrate great distances. Susan asks, do tufted puffins migrate?
They do. That's another question we would love to have a better answer to. We know that they migrate out of the Salish Sea. We know that they migrate out of the inshore waters of basically Washington waters. There are observations of them out in the middle of the North Pacific in the winter, which sounds pretty miserable, I must say. But that's all we really have. 4 years ago, we tried to actually begin to address that by putting some satellite tags out on tufted puffins right at the end of the breeding season, with the hope of getting at least some insight into where they go during the winter months. And we tried boat-based captures at night and had no success. just lost a lot of sleep. The next year we tried catching them on, because again, we were trying to minimize as much as possible the disturbance on the colonies. And so by trying to catch them at night, they don't associate what happens to them with a colony, whereas if you pull them out of a burrow where they're captured coming out of their burrow, that's a trauma, that's a stress that they're saying, the last time I came into this burrow, it did not go so well, and that can cause them in theory to abandon. So we're trying to minimize that. Anyway, we did try to capture some birds on Destruction Island towards the end of the breeding season 3 summers ago. Had little success. We caught one, we put the transmitter on it, and 3 days later we suspect that it ripped it off. So we got a tufted puffin that was basically noodling around, Destruction Island for a few days, and then it went dark. And their bills are powerful, and this is, if they're sutured in, I'm just using medical sutures, and it wouldn't take a tufted puffin much to say, what's on my back? I don't like this, and then just rip it off or clip it off. So yeah, we have almost no answer, no data for that response, but we do know that they don't stay in our in inshore waters at all.
Thank you. At the end, you mentioned about hoping to, I think, to get funding for some habitat restoration on Smith and Protection Islands. Is that also connected with non-native mammals as it is on Destruction, or are there non-native mammals on those islands, or is it something else?
Yeah, so thankfully not. Neither of those islands, neither Smith nor Protection, have invasive mammals. Protection does have deer, which are native, they're native to the region, and deer are actually quite good swimmers. So there's no evidence that they were introduced to Protection Island. But the refuge does, as part of their comprehensive conservation plan for Protection Island, their most recent plan, they actually have proposed to remove the deer from Protection Island. And the reason is that we think about it from a conservation perspective, or why the refuge was established in the first place. It was primarily for seabirds, and deer on an island like Protection Island, which is very erosive. The soil is very fragile, and deer moving across slopes, they do cause a lot of damage. And they also are grazing down the vegetation, which also enhances erosion rates. And so we helped consult with them. We're not experts in the removal of deer, but they have it in their current plan. And hopefully within the next few years, those deer will be removed. And then they'll just have to see. Deer are perfectly capable of swimming across, from Diamond Point or something, if they're so inclined.
So what sort of restoration would you be doing? Is it replacing invasive plant species, or?
Yeah, a lot of it is. So many of the invasive plants are annuals. So things like cheatgrass, and then there's a number of other species. Cheatgrass is a dominant species on Protection Island, and so they tend to crowd out a lot of the natives. They grow up early, but they're an annual, so they don't produce any meaningful root systems, because that's not a good use of energy for an annual. It's all about flowering and producing a lot of seeds, and then you die. And so on Protection Island, and it's a little bit more advanced on Protection Island, and it was kind of accelerated by the fire actually last August, because it burned, it basically only burned on state land. And so state land, there's a little, because it's not part of the refuge, state land is managed differently, and the restrictions of what you can do are not as onerous. So the state, so we were talking with the state, and Scott has been, as a state senior research scientist, has been helping to lead this along with some of their habitat experts. We said, look, the fire was unfortunate, and there was habitat lost, and there were birds that died. But can we think about this as a potential opportunity? So it burned through. What about using that as an opportunity to start outplanting native plants, native perennials, to try to and help jumpstart them, because you've at least temporarily cleared out the invasives. There's still a seed bank there that will come back. But here's this opportunity maybe to jumpstart a little bit some native plant recovery. Because once they're established, especially those like bunch grasses, those perennial bunch grasses, they can resist the non-natives without any problem whatsoever. Because again, they're deeper rooted, they grow up taller, and they're robust to that. But we need to get them started, and that can in turn help stabilize soil, reduce erosion, and improve breeding habitat conditions for the birds, as well as just improve the quality of the natural habitat of the island overall. And then the idea would be, and this is much earlier with Smith, but the idea would be to possibly do something similar on Smith, at least along the cliff edges where it is the most erosive, and where all the puffins are breeding, and a lot of that's where most of the pigeon guillemots are, and rhinoceros auklets too.
I had an opportunity to take a boat ride around Smith for the first time this past summer, and I noticed it was just like this dense row of burrows right at the top of the cliff, among
Yes.
the roots, I suppose, of the, yeah. Is that primarily where all the nests are?
Yeah, so that the island is kind of wedge shaped. So that west facing, the face of the island that's kind of that's pointed towards the Strait of Juan de Fuca, the highest part of the island that's where all the puffins breed, along that cliff edge. A lot of the rhinoceros auklets breed along there, and pigeon guillemots too. The rhinoceros auklets will actually, if you were to go over that ridge, the cliff top, and then onto the slope behind it, there are rhinoceros auklet burrows that will extend probably 10 or 15 meters inland from the edge. And they'll also go fairly far down to lower elevations. So they're not as dependent on those cliff edges, those really exposed faces, as the puffins seem to be.
Thank you so much, Peter. Patty, do you want to, I could keep coming up with questions, but it's almost 9 o'clock. So I think,
Well, I think we probably need to close up shop as far as that is concerned. I would like everybody to come off of their mute buttons and to come onto their cameras and show Peter how much we really appreciate him. And it's just wonderful information that you gave us. And I mean, it makes us sad in way to hear all of the downturns of it and everything else. But I was really glad to hear all the things that you said positively to help us. So that was really good. So
yeah,
anyway.
Thank you. And thank you all again. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you tonight. Hopefully, in the next few years, I can come up and give a talk in person. Not the same talk, different topic, I promise. But I think it is really important to recognize it. And as a conservation biologist, there's a tension, there's a constant tension whenever, at least for me, whenever I'm speaking with people about things, because you want to be honest. You don't want to be Pollyanna and say everything is lovely, and but we also don't want people to feel as though it's hopeless, because then people don't act. And so that balance of saying, yes, there are big challenges, and for some species things are not going well, but that we are doing some good things, and we have the capacity to do even more. And that all of you, have as much a role to play in it as me or Scott or Tom. Those roles are complementary. They're not the same, but they're complementary. And I think, again, Francis and Phyllis's groundbreaking work with the pigeon guillemot is a great example of that. Think of the hundreds of people, thousands of people probably at this stage, who have engaged with seabirds on a more intimate, meaningful level than they ever would have done without that project. And with that comes that commitment and that curiosity and that wonder of, well, seabirds, I'd never really thought about them much, but pigeon guillemots are pretty cool. Like, what other seabirds are out there? Who knows where that leads people?
Oh, I see a grunt. Yeah.
So I think, that curiosity is really piqued by those lived experiences. So there are very real challenges out there, but there's also a huge amount of energy and expertise and commitment and love out there too.
Well, thank you very, very much for your participation tonight. And again, give him a round of applause. And
thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Okay. All right.
My pleasure. Thank you all. Have a good night.
You too.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yes, we're done. Oh, there's Vivian. Hi, Vivian. Where's your picture? She must have fallen asleep. Okay.